Hi everyone, this next module is about governance. So in this first video, we'll talk just a little bit of an introduction about what that means and really focus on the nonprofit side. In the next video, we'll be getting into public decision making and what governance looks like on the government side of things. So the question of governance really boils down to the question of who's in charge. And this can take a lot of different forms depending on the context of the organization. For nonprofits, there's questions of who determines what the organization's bylaws are. That's usually the board of directors. But also, who sets the organization's policies and structures? Who makes those determinations? Um, and then, on the federal side, who makes the laws? The same goes at the state and local level. Who determines, where regulations are made and what the regulations become? Um, Public rules, the Code of Federal Regulations that I mentioned previously. Those regulations do have the force of law. Administrative agencies have the ability to enforce the laws. But, the structure and what those agencies do and some of their policies are determined by Congress. So, in terms of who's in charge, it's a little bit of a mixed bag there. Something really important that I wanted to make sure that I mention here is that there's a big difference between governments and nonprofit organizations in terms of what they can and can't do. All governments, but especially the state and local governments, are really limited to a great extent in what they're allowed to do, because what they're allowed to do has to be explicitly stated in a constitution or, permission be given by the federal government, like, waiving certain requirements for state programs on a case-by-case basis. Or there has to be some law that creates an agency and gives it the authority to do certain things. On the other hand, both private businesses and nonprofit organizations are really only limited by laws that specify what they're not allowed to do. That's a really important distinction to make, especially when we think about governance, who's in charge, as well as, at what form, what different programs and initiatives happen. Because especially at the state and local level, if you don't have the authority to get out and develop some new program or implement it, then you may find yourself working in conjunction with nonprofits to fill in some of those gaps, like I've been previously mentioning. Hello. I think you guys might have already seen Sarah Jane Smith a couple of times. Hello, boop. All right. So next up, boards of directors in nonprofits are usually the source of governance. You have a board that works in conjunction with an executive director and top staff, usually assuming that the organization has enough people to have an executive director or staff. And the nonprofit boards have a lot of different roles that they have to play. So here are their core functions. First, leading the organization, setting the path and direction, and setting the mission of the organization. They do establish policies, whether that's in terms of the bylaws, determining things like how much money is the executive director allowed to expend without getting permission from the board. What are our human resource policies? If we provide services to people, how do we determine if they're eligible? Those are all policies that might be set by a board of directors. Securing essential resources. That's not just talking about money, although money is a big one. That might be land or other capital assets like vehicles and buildings. That also includes human resources and making sure that you've got both the right staff and volunteers. Then they also need to ensure that these resources are being used effectively. If you're not able to to make good use of your of the resources that you've managed to bring in, then the nonprofit's not going to be able to perform as well as it could. Again, performance, leading and managing the CEO. So that executive director or other person who's in charge, making sure that they are keeping everyone else underneath them in the organization accountable. And then there are other, important pieces, engaging with constituents, knowing who your clients are and other stakeholders. It's not just your clients, it's anyone who might have an interest in what your organization does. That can be both local and that can be very broad. Ensuring and enabling accountability. So, making sure that um, all of the people in your organization are, upholding your policies and procedures, um, that they are using those resources effectively, and if not, that they develop plans to do so more effectively, and then to ensure that the board itself is effective. A lot of times boards need to or individual board members may need additional training in order to make themselves more effective in leading this organization. So that leads me to how our boards set up. Usually you're going to have key officers and committees. Your officers are going to be a chairman and usually a vice chairman, a secretary, and a treasurer. The secretary being the one who keeps minutes of board meetings, the treasurer who is chiefly in charge of monitoring financial performance and, those monthly financial reports or quarterly, depending on how frequently the board meets. You're also going to have a lot of key committees. And this would include, like your executive committee that is comprised of your officers and usually your executive director, and any other key committee chairs. The executive committee usually gets together and meets before regular board meetings and goes over all of the information that's going to be presented in the board meetings. Sometimes they also make key decisions and make recommendations to the broader board of directors. You might have nominating or recruiting committees who look for other board candidates or people who might come and serve on the board in the future. Fundraising or development committees are very common and very important because securing those resources is always a big deal. Finance committee, similarly monitoring the finances of the organization and possibly any investments that the organization might have, especially if there are large endowment funds and things like that. These are sometimes, especially for smaller boards, folded into that executive committee. But when you have larger boards of directors or very large organizations, they may be treated separately. You might also have separate personnel committees who are, either part of setting personnel policies or even involved in hiring and firing of key employees and performance monitoring and evaluation. And then program committees who may be responsible for managing individual programs that the organization may offer. So, there are lots of different ways that these boards can be structured. And then in terms of how the people who serve on the board get on the board, there are a few different approaches that you might see. Elected board members, usually that's where the members of the board each get a vote and approve other people who are, nominated or approach the organization asking to join the board. Or sometimes, especially if you are coming from a membership type organization, they may be nominated from or actually choose to run for the board from among the membership. There are there are also what we call self-perpetuating boards. And these are boards where the founding members create the board and then, appoint others to join in. And, they basically, determine the terms of office and the maximum number of members in the bylaws, as is typical for almost all organizations. But usually this means that you're recruiting, your own people from within. And there can be disadvantages here in that you don't always get new blood and new ideas. This runs the risk of an issue that we refer to as founder syndrome, where, things just sort of become an echo chamber. On the other hand, sometimes self-perpetuating boards can be a little entrepreneurial and go out to look for those people who might be able to bring new ideas and some change into the organization. You also might have appointed board members. This is where different external organizations or groups appoint members to represent their interests. So this is usually what we call excuse me, we also have what we call ex officio members, which are very similar here. And ex officio members means that they exist as a board member by virtue of their position in some other organization. So think, the mayor of a city or the superintendent of the local school board is considered an ex officio member of a local educational nonprofit organization. This may or may not mean that they are actively involved in the governance of that organization, but it means that they have a role and that they have a vote. You can also have hybrid boards, and these are these are fairly common, and they can take any sort of different shapes, where maybe you've got a mix of elected or self-perpetuating members, as well as some appointed or ex officio members. Honestly, one of the things that I say in the nonprofit world and even in public agencies is that the needs, like anything, it all depends on the context, on the size of the organization, on the type of work that you're doing, on the different political climates of the communities that you serve. So hybrid boards can be really useful in crafting, the various approaches that you need to best serve your organization. There are also some really important competencies that the board as a whole should have. And as a whole, I mean that every different member is not going to be like in the 95th percentile of each of these different competencies. Some people are going to have better analytical minds. Some people are going to have better interpersonal skills than others and be able to do, and some people are going to be really good at the politicking and the strategy. The goal is to put together a board that has people with all of these different competencies that the board can draw upon for the different activities that they're going to need to do. Often when I talk about, setting up a new board for an organization, I'll also say that you want to bring in people from very different sectors. So you probably want someone with some financial or, banking history, who can serve as your treasurer. Depending on your organization, you might want someone with a bit of a legal background. If you're in social services, you probably want someone with a background in those social services. You might want to have clients serving on your board, or you may want to have a separate advisory board whose chair has one vote representing the board, and they serve as an ex officio member. There are lots of different ways that you want to go about putting together a board, but finding people with different subject matter expertise areas is always very, very useful. So moving on, there are some important responsibilities that the members of boards of directors have. And some of those are actual legal responsibilities, and some of them are more general. From the perspective of legal responsibilities, there are three really key ones. The first is the duty of care. And that means that the board needs to monitor the nonprofit's finances with due diligence. They need to make sure that money is not being siphoned away for places that it's not intended to go, that it is being used both responsibly and making sure that programs are performing as best as they can be and that resources are being used efficiently. There's the duty of loyalty. And this is where the nonprofit's financial interests have to come first. Board members should not be able to gain financially by virtue of serving on that board. If they have conflicts of interest, especially financial ones, those need to be disclosed. There should be an annual process of disclosing any financial conflicts of interest. And they need to recuse themselves or take whatever steps are necessary to avoid those conflicts of interest if they arise. This also means that you need to avoid what they call private inurement, INUREMENT. What this means is that, especially in terms of, executive directors, or if there are any board members that are compensated for their service, that, it should not be, excessive compensation or unreasonable amounts of money, and also making sure that if there is excess revenue, that there should not be excessive compensation given to board members or used for their benefit. So that means no lavish parties, no ridiculous bonuses. There are actual financial limitations like that. Then there is also the duty of obedience. And this means that you have to comply with all of the applicable laws, of course, but also the bylaws and the mission of the organization. Now, if those legal responsibilities aren't fulfilled, then since 1996, the IRS has been permitted to levy sanctions, what they call intermediate sanctions, when they identify improper actions through audits or other means. And that means that financial penalties could be handed out to individual board members. There are some provisions of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that apply to nonprofits. You have to have a whistleblower policy. There are document maintenance provisions, things like that, legally you're required to do, as well as annually filing a Form 990, or, a 990 EZ, or a 990 postcard, depending on how much revenue your organization has each year. And those forms do ask some questions about the governance and the legal responsibilities and those whistleblower protections and what have you for your organization. There are also some, these general responsibilities that I mentioned. Obviously, appointing the executive director, coming up with that initial mission statement, revising it when it needs to be revised, guide and approve programs, establish and enforce performance standards, approving budgets and and making sure that finances are on track. Also, developing strategic plans. This might even include having some fundraising responsibilities. In some organizations, nonprofits might expect board members to achieve what we call a give or get, which means that you either go out and raise, so you get a certain amount of money each year, or you write the check yourself. That could be a very small amount of money. That could be a very large amount of money. That's one of those things that we often discourage, especially smaller organizations, from, because it can be an equity issue and can really limit the ability, especially of those in high-risk populations or individuals of low socioeconomic status, groups that really tend to be underrepresented in nonprofit boards, it can be another barrier from their participation. So, one other thing to consider is the relationship between the board and that CEO or executive director, and where the power lies in different situations. There's obviously a risk of rubber stamping just whatever that executive director might want to do. But on the other hand, too much involvement from the board can stifle innovation from the staff. It can become too micromanaging and can really become a problem for um, for the organization's performance and for morale. So to that end, there are a few different approaches, or what we call models of governance in nonprofit organizations. So the first of these is what we call the policy governance model. And in this model, the idea is that the boards just focus on the organization's policies rather than the day-to-day activities. It's very hands-off in that situation, or yeah, in that respect, excuse me. But there are 4 different situations where, under the policy governance model, that there are areas that the board should act, but should work, through policies to enable change in the organization. And so the first is identifying the ends that needs to be achieved. That's the mission. That's the goals of the organization, individual objectives. And then there's the means to the ends, and that does involve setting boundaries on what the CEO can and can't do. That might be managed somewhat through the bylaws, but it also may be enforced through certain personnel policies. There's the relationship between the board and the staff. So, again, that can, you can call those types of policies a lot of different things, but what this would be doing is outlining the responsibilities of the CEO and the responsibilities of the board in case there are additional things that the board is expected to do, such as, fundraising or committee service, things like that. And this sets the responsibilities of the and performance and evaluation standards, both for the board members and for the CEO. It may be that there are underperforming board members who are not, living up to their expectations. Maybe they're not attending meetings as frequently as they should. Maybe they're not being as active in fundraising activities as they have committed to doing. And that might be something that you want to have a policy to address that through a process. And then you can have policies about the process of governance itself. What's the board's role, and how is it going to operate? What are the procedures for adding new board members, things like that. And so this is, again, it's a very hands-off approach to governance. And often we use the phrase steer, not row, to describe this. So the idea, and this comes from a book written in the late 80s, early 90s called Reinventing Government, that's really sort of found its way into the nonprofit sector. And the idea is that you should steer the boat as a manager or a board member, not row the boat. That's determined, that the rowing should be left for the line employees. So that's the policy governance model. In the governance as leadership model, this is where the board and the CEO work together to look at different issues that face the organizations and determine what's important and what they need, what the board needs to act on, and what should be left up to the CEO. In this model, the board's kind of, I guess you could describe it as code shifting, but in this case, it's mode shifting. And there are 3 different modes of governance that the board is going to switch between. The first is what we call the fiduciary mode. This is where you're being concerned with the assets, performance, and mission orientation fulfilling the legal responsibilities of the organization, making sure that you're doing what it has to do and that things are being done in the organization's best interest. Then there's the strategic mode. And this is when you're looking at the long-term goals and plans. What are your objectives and how are you going to achieve them over the next 5, 10, 30 years? And then there's generative mode. And that's where you're looking at things as a visionary, sort of trying to act as a visionary. What could the world look like? If the world was perfect, or if we had, you know, 5 times as much money as we have right now, what could we do? What could we do with unlimited resources? And using those brilliant ideas to sort of inform strategy, develop ideas for new seed programs and pilots and things like that. Um, all three are necessary, and the CEO and the board should work together in doing all of these things under that governance as leadership model. And then there's the board-centered leadership model. Now, this is based on the concept of executive psychological centrality, which is just a fancy term for saying that the CEO is the one, or the executive director is the one who is ultimately responsible for the success or failure of an organization. The buck stops here. And under this model, the idea is that the CEO is the one that's going to lead the board in what it does. And it's, the job of the executive director is to make sure both to maintain relationships with with board members and make sure that their relationships among the board members are smooth to the extent they can be, because believe me, boards have drama. But doing what they need to do to make sure that the board functions and does what the executive director needs the board to do to support them. So yeah, there are different, all sorts of different approaches to how boards can act. And there's no clear answer to who's in charge or who should be in charge when you talk about a nonprofit organization. So that's nonprofits and governance for this model. Next up, we will move into governance and decision-making in public organizations.